Hello and welcome to Seminar 5. In this short video I'm just going to be talking about some of the key points about social action and social movements, and if you've got your PowerPoints there for Seminar 5, I'm looking at those right now, and we're just going to be looking at how social action is linked and connected to social movements and also to radical social change. That often social action is associated with protest movements, and sometimes it's also used in community development when there's need for a more overt community action, such as a threat of something being closed, like a health centre, a hospital, threat to bushland, that kind of thing, raising issues around concerns for housing. It can be part of community development. Just having a look at slide 3 here, which is going back to Rothman's typology and the three main organisations of community work. And this week we're going to be looking at social action, which is that third column on slide 3, which you're familiar with now on the right, and that the goals particularly of social action in this typology is around looking at power shifts and institutional change and looking at social change. And there's assumptions behind that is that there's inequality and that power needs to be challenged for that to be addressed. And often consciousness raising is used, mobilising of people to take action and to address that issue. So in Rothman's typology, it's that particular third panel that we're looking at today, social action. And when we go back to look at Popple's model of community work practice on slide 4, social action and social movements is most closely aligned with community action in Popple's model. So if you have a look at slide 4, you see that that's highlighted in red. Community action in this model is described as usually class-based, but there's conflict focused. That's really central to the need for the community action, and there's some examples there: squatting movement, welfare rights, and resistance against planning and redevelopment, the action of tenants, as I mentioned before, about housing issues. One of the things that social action I guess is highlighted by is it's often a disadvantaged segment of the population getting together, being organised to make demands on the larger community, on government, on bureaucracies for increased resources and for improved treatment. There's a focus on social justice and democracy and the redistribution of power and resources and decision making. So the action is what stands out in this regard, that it's more than creating protest, although that will be part of it, but social action is looking at having an issue addressed, having an answer, having an alternative, having a picture that of the future that sees this problem will have been addressed by certain changes. On slide 6, just mentioning a couple of names here that we have referred to before in this unit. Paulo Freire, the Brazilian educator, his writings are very influential in social action, and Saul Alinsky, who is American and who is very much involved around locality, social action, neighbourhood organising, is another influential person in the theory around social action. There are others as well. Gandhi's practice of non-violence, Martin Luther King. You could probably also name many others as well who've influenced the practice of social action and what it actually looks like today. On slide 7, the example here of social action that a lot of people are familiar with, union protests and strikes. And the first example that I've got there on that slide is the Wave Hill Walk-Off in 1966, when the Aboriginal people, the Gurindji, who are working on a station run by Lord Vestey, demanded that they wanted to be paid in money rather than being paid in given rations. They wanted to actually be paid properly for their work and acknowledged for the skilled stockmen and stockwomen that they were. And that walk-off is really significant because you can see by the dates that it actually ended up being much bigger and having greater ramifications than what they intended initially, and it became a very significant protest about land rights. And it went on for 9 years and resulted in the acknowledgement of the Gurindji people as the owners of that land. That's an example, I guess, of how social action can become bigger than what it was originally intended, and that it can go on for quite a long time. Some of the other examples there are through the organised unions in Australia, and unions have been really successful in many countries in upholding worker rights and things such as rates of pay, access to sick leave, holiday entitlements. A lot of these rights, I guess, or fundamental entitlements for workers have been achieved through the work of unions. And there's just a few examples there of different union actions that have occurred in Australia. And I guess by striking, by not working, that's a very common social action that then brings attention to the general public and then to the government, the concerns or the grievances of those who are striking. This next slide that I'm looking at, slide 8, it's human rights social action. So there's also social action that is taken by and acted by people for whom it's not their own personal issue, but people take on the concerns of other people on a human rights basis. And there's a couple of examples here on slide 8 around how other people, regular Australians in this instance, have got organised because of their concern about the fundamental abuses of human rights in our country or overseas. And one example is the treatment of asylum seekers, so people who have fled their own country for a whole range of reasons, usually for fear of persecution, and have fled and come to Australia for safety. Australia has got particular rules and legislation around the treatment of asylum seekers that's quite harsh, and there's been an upswelling, I guess, of Australian response to setting up groups and networks around raising the concerns of how asylum seekers are treated in Australia. So groups such as Rural Australians for Refugees, Grandmothers for Refugees. In Darwin there's a group called Darwin Asylum Seeker Advocacy Network. And so these are people standing up for others and raising these issues and bringing these to the public awareness and doing work with government as well around those issues. And other examples are the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, and there's been significant protests in Australia about each of these. The next slide that I'm looking at on slide 9 is another kind of action, environmental action, and again these examples are Australian, and there's many examples all around the world around the significance of people being active and taking on action because of their concerns around the protection of the natural environment. And in Australia, in Tasmania, the Franklin River is one example of this. In Kakadu National Park in the Northern Territory, there's been significant actions against the setting up of the mine Jabiluka. And there are in Darwin, there are still current environmental actions that are happening around the INPEX and the Darwin Harbour, which is a gas pipeline that's been laid in the Darwin Harbour to take gas out of the Northern Territory to Japan, and the impacts that that has on the marine life, the flora and the fauna, the water in the Darwin Harbour. So there's actions currently happening around that gas plant in the Kimberley region, the carbon tax, the mining tax. These are ongoing issues that are happening. On slide 10, I'm looking at that right now, and there's a term that people might be familiar with, not in my backyard, social action. That is not to denigrate or belittle the concerns that people have when there is some change or something being put upon a community that's going to impact on people's qualities of life, is perhaps going to impact on people's freedom or impact on people's health. So the social action that arises in these circumstances may be when there's a proposal for a jail, for example, to be located close to a residential area, or a mine where that's going to have impacts on the local population. A nuclear waste dump is a very current example, as the Australian government and the South Australian government, I think, are looking for somewhere to leave nuclear waste, and the different oppositions and debates that are being had about, firstly, where is it safe? Is it safe to have nuclear waste, and where can that be? A mobile phone tower, again, people get active about this as well because of the health concerns that people may have about the location of a mobile phone tower close to where people are living. And there's a couple of other examples there. The clearing of bushland, the closure of a facility such as a school, and people losing access to resources that they currently have. So while that term, not in my backyard, is used to describe people getting active when something closely affects them because it's located in their neighbourhood, or it's going to be happening down their street or in their town, that often does become, for some people, the motivation to get involved in a social action. I'm just going to finish this first little video by just having a look at a couple of terms that we discussed these in the lecture, and these are some terms that may be used in the literature that you're reading around social action and social movements, and it's just useful to be familiar with how these words might be used and when you might feel comfortable to use them, and what they actually mean. And we had interesting conversations about this in the class, about mobilisation, of which there was lots of discussion about what that means and how organising, how getting people ready to act is often what mobilisation is referring to. And we had big discussions also about the word democratisation, and that word comes from democracy. And so how we use these words is really important, even though the word democratisation usually is referring to the transition to an increased democratic political regime. So the movement from perhaps a dictatorship to a more democratic government. However, the word democracy and democratic, there are other words that you might be familiar with using in terms of representing people's interests, that people having a right to speak, having a right to vote. We talk about democratic processes. These are terms that will come up in your reading around social action. And consciousness raising is another critical term that we'll be talking about throughout this unit as well. The importance of people having access to information so that they can be informed about an issue, and that in itself can be part of the process where people are empowered and they're motivated to act. And there were some really great examples in the class about consciousness raising when people get information and understand about what something really means, that then results in people wanting to be part of a movement and wanting to be active. We also talked a bit too about how a lot of people in the community might have an opinion about an issue or might not agree with something, but when we're talking about social action and social movements, the difference there is that people step out, people take action, and people get involved. They move out of their comfort zone from having an opinion about an issue to being prepared to take steps to act. Thank you.